Hi there, friends. Welcome to episode 50 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. Today, I know I look a lot different than you usually see me presented in my videos to you. And not only did I wake up today and drive to my chiropractor's appointment and find out I had a nail in my tire, so my car is in the shop unexpectedly. When I sat down to edit this video that you're watching today, which occurred the day before I published. Normally I'm done a week in advance, but here I am trying to edit the video for you the day before it goes live. And 2/3 of the files that I created were corrupt. I sat down and recorded quite a long episode. The raw footage was over an hour in length, and halfway through the files, for reasons that I don't understand, they go black and then the noise disappears. So all of that time that I spent recording is completely gone. So I am not going to leave you with nothing today, but it will not be as coiffed as our episodes normally would be. So I hope you will enjoy what I'm sharing today. So today's episode, our 50th episode, is a collection of questions about yarn. Each one of these questions have come in over the last couple of months after other videos were published. And each question are excellent questions, but weren't quite enough to create a full episode. So I decided to compile them all together in one so we could, keep all of our yarny questions together. So the first question is about yarn substitutions, specifically when you're substituting one type of fiber for another in regards to how it is spun. Several months ago, I did a video about yarn substitutions where I compared worsted spun yarn to woolen spun yarn. And so I thought I would just help clarify a little bit more what that looks like and how you might be able to differentiate it. But before I even do that, I will let you know that I have a link in the description below the video to yarnsub.com, which we've talked about before, where I have looked up woolen spun yarns. Of course, I'm familiar with some woolen spun yarns that are out there, but there were several on the list that I didn't even know were woolen spun. So I would encourage you to check out that list and see if you have any in your stash already so that you can go take a look at it and think about what I'm about to share in just a few minutes to see if it helps you identify visually or texturally the difference between a worsted spun and a woolen spun yarn. So when a worsted spun yarn is spun, the fibers are spun together quite tightly. There's no intention of trapping any air. You're trying to create a nice, compact, dense fiber that when it is plied up is very smooth. Depending on the fiber content, it may or may not have a halo to it, but in most cases, the fibers are very smooth. The plies are very, that's upside down, easily differentiated from each other so you can see the structure of the yarn. I can't say with 100% certainty, but I think all superwash yarns are worsted spun. I don't believe, but I don't know for sure, that superwash yarns have been spun into woolen spun. That just seems to be the opposite nature of what you're trying to do with a woolen spun. So the odds are quite good that if anywhere in the description on the ball band, it says superwash, you can just about guarantee that it is a worsted spun yarn. In contrast, a woolen spun yarn is spun with the intention of trapping air between the fibers. When the wool is spun, the fibers are going in all different directions when they come from the fiber source, so you end up getting a much loftier, lightweight yarn. Very often, it will also have slightly more of a halo than a superwash yarn. By halo, I just mean the little fuzzy bits that show up around the edge of your project or around the skein of yarn itself. Now, with that said, woolen spuns are not the only ones that have halos, but if you were to hold a woolen and a worsted spun side by side, you would likely see that the woolen spun one looks a little fluffier or fuzzier or slightly less controlled in terms of the order of the fibers. So it's important to note that both woolen spun and worsted spun yarns can be plied. If you think about a very common woolen spun yarn, Brooklyn tweed, not all of their yarns, but their shelter, their loft, and their quarry bases are all woolen spun yarns. They are in fact plied yarns, but because of the fuzzier nature of each of their plies, they are harder to sort of untwist and see. So I just wanted to make it clear that both worsted and woolen spun yarns can be plied. So the last thing to note when it comes to worsted versus woolen spun is because of the air that gets trapped inside a woolen spun yarn, they are lighter, a little bit loftier, so you get more yardage per gram. Of course, any type of difference in fibers could change the relationship between the weights per gram of any given woolen spun yarn, but when compared to a worsted spun of the same fiber content, you're typically going to find that the woolen spun gets more yardage per grams. So as I mentioned when I first started answering this question, I'm going to have a link below to my search on yarnsub.com for woolen spun yarns. You'll see Brooklyn tweed listed on there. You'll see Harrisville yarns listed on there. Jameson of Shetland, I believe, is also on there. So just take a look at the yarns that you see there. If you have some in your stash, go compare them to your worsted spun yarns, which are going to be your superwash, your very high twist yarns, and see if you can visually differentiate the two. In most cases, I would say that if it is a woolen spun yarn, it's going to say so on the label. In most other cases, you can probably assume that it's a worsted spun yarn. So our next topic is still about yarn, but it was a write-in question. It says, if you need to change your needle size to achieve gauge, how does that affect the required amount of yarn? Like if you go down a needle size, will you require more yarn? If you go up a needle size, will you require less yarn? In short, no. So when you are working towards gauge in a project, the collective gauge that you see is made up of stitches. So if we say that the gauge is 18 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters, each single stitch is a specific size. When you match gauge, that means that your stitch size is the same as the designer's. So you'll use the same amount of yarn to quite literally create the loop over the needle at that gauge. So if a designer uses a US 8 to achieve a specific gauge and you use a US 9 to achieve that same gauge, you are matching the amount of yarn to create each loop. So your yardage quantities should be the same or within a very close margin to what the designer has specified in the pattern. If you match stitch gauge, but you don't quite match row gauge, you may end up with variances in yardage quantities. Because we all hold our needles differently, and the needle material can make a difference in how we construct our stitches. There's so many variables that can change our stitch construction. It's very common for a stitch gauge to match, but a row gauge to not match. If your row gauge does not match the pattern, it's quite likely that your yardage will vary from what the pattern calls for. Most designers, if not all designers, include a certain percentage overage in their yardage quantities to account for that variance in row gauge. So as long as you have purchased the amount of yarn that the designer calls for in the pattern, you shouldn't have any trouble with yardage running out. Keep in mind that that variance in gauge overage, let's say they added 5 to 10% overage for their pattern, is not going to cover you changing the gauge of the pattern. It's really just there as a buffer so that if you take more rows or less rows than the designer to knit to the same length, you shouldn't run out of yarn. So the third question was actually a really fun one. It came on my episode from 2 weeks ago, where we talked about substituting yards on the fly when you're changing yard weights. So the question was, isn't DK weight yarn just double knitting with fingering weight? And the short answer is no, not technically, but also kind of. So DK weight or double knit weight yarn is a reference to DK weight yarn being constructed of 8 plies, or the equivalent of what would be called 4-ply yarn. For those of us in the States, we would say that a 4-ply is roughly a fingering weight yarn. However, because a DK weight yarn isn't required to be made up of 8 plies, much like a fingering weight isn't guaranteed to be made up of 4 plies, they aren't strictly double or half of each other. So let's take a look at a real-world example of a yarn company that carries both a fingering and a DK weight yarn that is the same yarn makeup. Specifically, it is 90% superwash merino and 10% nylon. So this particular company has a sock weight yarn that is 400 yards per 120 grams, which works out to 3.3 yards per gram. Their DK weight yarn is 275 yards per 130 grams, or 211 yards per single gram. So if we were to say that the DK is double the fingering weight, the DK would need to be more like 1.65 yards per single gram, not 2.1. So no, technically or structurally, maybe that's a better way to say it, DK is not fingering weight held double. But here's the kinda. Many patterns that you can find on Ravelry or whatever designer source that you're looking at will hold fingering weight double for a project, and will say you can do an equivalent gauge using a single strand of DK weight yarn. So I went online, of course, before this episode, or before I recorded this episode the first time, to look for sources to confirm or refute what I'm saying to you. And what's really interesting is I found sources that both confirmed that 2 strands of fingering weight is DK weight, Ravelry being one of them, but also I found other sources that said 2 strands of fingering weight is the equivalent of 1 strand of worsted weight. So I think in some cases you have to just look at the actual makeup of the yarn and how fine it is to say whether 2 strands would be DK or 2 strands would be worsted. So there is some room for interpretation there in terms of them being equivalents. You can likely match gauge if a project calls for 2 strands of fingering held double with a DK or a worsted weight yarn. But I would say structurally, if you were trying to classify it, no, I would not say that DK is double knit fingering weight yarn. I hope that makes sense. Okay, our last conversation surrounding yarn today is actually based on a write-in question that I received through my email, and it was a really fun one. So the question is this: my wool is so old it doesn't give how long each skein is. It gives a weight of 50 grams per skein only. Is there a method I can use other than unwinding and measuring meter by meter? Yes, you can. And it's just going to depend a little bit on the put up of your yarn. If this is your put up, if you have your yarn in a hank, it's going to be a lot easier. Maybe, kind of. There's a tedious portion to this, but I think it's pretty quick. If you have your yarn in a skein or a ball or a cake, like one of those donut cakes, or If you've already wound it and it's a cake, it takes a slightly different approach. So let's talk about this one first. This is actually a DK weight yarn that I spun on my own that I'm rather proud of. So to figure out how much yarn you have, the first thing you're going to do is take it out of the hank and pull it out to its full length. You can see I've got a thumb in one end and a thumb in the other end. What you're going to do is measure with a ruler from thumb to thumb. In this case, my measurement is 1 yard. Then, because this is a loop, right, 1 yard is the bottom and then 1 yard is the top, you have to multiply that length by 2. Because I know one side is 1 yard, I know that the total thing is 2 yards. If you measured it and it's not exactly 1 yard, you're simply going to double what your measurement is. Conveniently, mine is 2 yards, so it's a nice tidy number. Now here's the sort of tedious part of it. What you're going to do is take 1/2 of the loop in your hand and you're going to count out every single strand across that loop. Now, I did this before I got on the video, so you don't have to watch me count. I have 127 strands in 1/2 of the loop. So all I have to do then is multiply that 127 strands by 2 yards, which is the total length of my loop. So I know that this hank of yarn is 254 grams, or 254 yards. I apologize. If your yarn is in a skein or a cake, you have 2 options. The first thing you can do is get out your yarn swift, wind all of it onto the swift in a big long loop that would mimic this, and repeat the process of what I just went through. Measure the length of it, double it to find the total circumference of the loop, and then count your strands. That is going to be the least sacrificial to your yarn. Your other option, if you don't have a yarn swift and you can't wind out all of that yarn, is to pull out a tail of your yarn and measure out 1 yard. Or if you're in metric, because I believe this person who wrote in was in metric, measure out 1 meter. Your next step is going to use a small scale. I have linked below to a kitchen scale that I love to use because it works in decimal grams. So weigh that 1 meter and find out how much 1 meter or 1 yard of yarn weighs for that particular ball. Then, once you know that weight, you can take your ball band off and weigh the rest of your skein. Let's say I measured out 1 meter and it was 1/2 gram. If I weigh the rest of my skein, and even with that 1 meter, it's still 50 grams, I'm going to divide my 50 grams by 0.5 grams, and I'm going to figure out that it weighs, or that I have 100 yards. Actually, let me just check that amount. 50 divided by 0.5, yes, 100 yards. So basically you're working the math backwards a little bit. The only downside with this method where you're pulling out 1 meter of the yarn is you now have a meter of yarn that you really can't do much with. But it is an option if you're not able to wind out your yarn into a big loop to measure it using the first method. Okay, so that is it for today, folks. And today is a bit of a bittersweet video for me. So I have thoroughly enjoyed spending my time with you over the last 1.5 years, sharing what I know, helping you on your knitting journeys. But at the current time, especially after the big letdown of the first recording of this video getting corrupted, I feel like I need to step away for a little while. Not only are my clients keeping me busy, which is an honor that I treat with care and make the priority for what I do every day at work, But I'm finding that the goals that I had set for this year, such as hosting a sock masterclass, hosting a sweater knit along for Rhinebeck, are not being able to be achieved because of the amount of time that goes into these videos. So for right now, I'm going to be stepping back and focusing on getting those things achieved before the end of the year. If I start to feel like my time is opening up, perhaps as we get closer to the fall or even the winter holidays, where my big projects for the year are complete, I may come back and create some more episodes. But right now, I don't feel like I have the bandwidth to give you the time that you deserve to learn from me, but I also need to give myself the time for creative endeavors as well as accomplishing all of my business goals. So truly, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for spending your time with me. For now, the weekly, or in this case, bi-weekly podcasts will pause. You probably won't see any emails from me for a little while if you are a subscriber. But if new videos do come about, please know I will reach out and let you know. If you're a subscriber here on YouTube, you'll get a notification. If you are a newsletter recipient, you will hear from me again. I am going to continue to make tutorial videos, just top-down technique tutorials, so you can look for some more of those coming. But for now, the podcast is going to take a little break. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. It's been an honor to get to know you. Please stay in touch through email if you would like. And as always, my friends, happy knitting.